Every single state in the US has a story it probably wishes you didn't know. A really dark chapter, a tragic mistake, or sometimes a moment so completely bizarre it just sounds made up. These are the skeletons in the closet of American history. So let's pull back that curtain and see what's rattling around in there.
So for real, does every state actually have a skeleton in its closet? Well, after digging into it, the answer is a huge resounding yes. I mean, we're talking about everything from near-apocalyptic accidents and literal murder conspiracies, all the way to, well, solutions to problems that are so strange they just defy all logic. To give you a taste, let's start with just a few quick examples that show how wild these stories can get. So what's with the number 2? Well, this is the number of 3.8 megaton nuclear bombs a B-52 bomber accidentally dropped over North Carolina back in 1961. We are talking about weapons 250 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. As one of the bombs was falling, it went through its whole arming sequence. You know what stopped it from detonating? A single, simple, low-voltage safety switch. Just think about that. One flimsy little switch, the kind you'd find in a basic home appliance, was all that stood between the entire East Coast and a nuclear catastrophe we created ourselves. Okay, now picture this. It's the 1920s, and members of the Osage tribe in Oklahoma are the wealthiest people per capita in the world because of oil found on their land. The government decides they can't manage their own money, so they appoint white guardians to oversee it all. What happened next was a horrifying, systematic plot where these so-called guardians murdered at least 60 Osage people just to inherit their fortunes. It reveals a much, much darker pattern. And for something on the stranger side of tragic, check out this number, 1.5 million. That's how many balloons were released during Cleveland's 1986 Balloon Fest. It was a charity event, meant to break a world record. But instead, a weather front came in and pushed all those balloons right back down, blanketing the city, grounding aircraft, and this is the tragic part, it hampered the Coast Guard's search for 2 fishermen whose boat had capsized on Lake Erie. A whimsical PR stunt ended up becoming a grim lesson in unintended consequences. You see, these stories aren't just random, shocking anecdotes. When you really look closer, you start to see some patterns emerge. And the first one, maybe the darkest one, is a clear pattern of injustice, where greed and power led to the calculated exploitation, and sometimes elimination, of the vulnerable. Let's go back to that Osage story, because the timeline here, it really shows the true horror. This wasn't just a few isolated crimes. It was a conspiracy that lasted for years, known as the Reign of Terror. The murders were brutal. Poison, bombs, you name it. It actually became one of the first big cases for the brand new Bureau of Investigation, which, would later become the FBI. It's just a chilling example of how incredible wealth made the Osage targets, not equals. So this number, 50 plus, this represents the estimated number of radium girls in Ottawa, Illinois, who died. These were young women in the 1920s who were hired to paint watch dials with glow-in-the-dark radioactive paint. And to get a really fine point on their brushes, they were told to use their lips, a technique they called lip pointing. They were literally ingesting poison day in and day out for a paycheck. And here is the part that'll make your blood boil. The company knew. The managers and chemists at the radium dial company actively avoided the stuff themselves. They used lead screens and tongs to handle it, but they told the women that the glowing paint was totally harmless. Some of the women even painted their teeth with it for fun before a night out. And when they started getting horribly sick with radiation poisoning, the company just denied everything, right up until the very end. Now, not all tragedies are born from pure malice. The next pattern we see is just as deadly, though. It's catastrophe born from negligence. This is what happens when cutting corners, ignoring warnings, and just plain old human error lead to an unimaginable loss of life. I mean, let's just walk through this one step by step because it's a textbook case of how a series of really bad decisions can cascade into an absolute disaster. In 1937, the New London School Board wanted to save just $300 a month on their heating bill. Their solution led to the school's unventilated crawl space filling up with highly volatile, completely odorless gas. For weeks, students have been complaining of headaches, but nobody listened. Then, on March 18th, a shop teacher turned on an electric sander, which created a spark. The explosion that followed killed 295 students and teachers. And you see the same awful pattern of cascading failures at the Coconut Grove nightclub in Boston in 1942. It wasn't just one thing that went wrong. It was literally everything. The owner had changed the emergency exits shut to stop people from skipping out on their bills. The club was only rated for 460 people, but had over 1,000 packed inside that night. So when a fire broke out, it was an absolute death trap. 492 people died, making it the deadliest nightclub fire in U.S. history.
Okay, let's just take a breath for a second because not every skeleton in the closet is a story of pure tragedy. Some of them are just, well, weird. These are the moments in history that take a hard left turn into the surreal, the kinds of stories that just make you scratch your head and ask, what on earth were they thinking? Believe it or not, this was a real bill proposed to the U.S. Congress in the early 1900s. You see, Louisiana's waterways were getting choked out by invasive water hyacinths, and at the same time, the whole country was facing a meat shortage. The proposed solution? Import hippos, let them eat all the invasive plants, and then ranch them for their meat, which was apparently nicknamed Lake Cow Bacon. The bill almost passed.
All right, so our next story revolves around this number, 76. This is how many beavers the Idaho Department of Fish and Game needed to relocate back in 1948. Seems like a pretty standard wildlife problem, right? Local residents were complaining about property damage, so the beavers had to go. Yeah, but their method was anything but standard. So how did they move them? They put the beavers into these specially designed boxes, loaded them onto a plane, and dropped them out of the sky using surplus World War II parachutes. Yes, they literally airdropped beavers into a new habitat. And the craziest part? It actually worked. Of the 76 beavers they dropped, 75 of them survived to start their new lives. Unbelievable. So, from the absolutely tragic to the truly bizarre, you can see how these stories paint a much more complex, much messier picture of our past. They're not just little footnotes in a history book. They're the skeletons that give shape to the country we live in today, whether we choose to look at them or not. So let's just pull it all together. We saw systemic injustice, where greed led to the murder of the Osage and the poisoning of the Radium Girls. We saw deadly negligence, where saving a few bucks cost hundreds of lives in Texas and Boston. And we saw some truly unbelievable choices, from a plan for hippo ranching to parachuting beavers. These aren't just one-off stories. They are themes that repeat themselves in our history. And really, that brings us to the final and, I think, most crucial point. Look, these stories are uncomfortable. They're tragic, and sometimes they're just absurd. And it's often way easier to forget them, right? To just focus on the triumphs. But what do we lose when we do that? How does forgetting these skeletons, these moments of failure and injustice and just sheer weirdness, change the story we tell about ourselves? And what might we learn if we just decided to remember?